For years, life in my quiet suburban neighborhood had followed the same steady rhythm. Families waved to each other as they drove to work, children rode bicycles down the cul-de-sac, and weekends were filled with the sound of lawnmowers and backyard barbecue. I had moved here for the peace, the sense of community, and the idea that my dog, a gentle golden retriever named Max, would finally have a yard big enough to play in. Max was not just a pet, he was part of the family. At 8 years old, he had settled into his calm, mellow temperament. He rarely barked, and when he did, it was usually no more than a single bark to announce a squirrel or a delivery truck. Most of the neighbors adored him. Children patted his head as they walked by, and even the mailman would greet him with a treat. But not everyone was happy with Max's presence. My next-door neighbor Linda had always carried a chip on her shoulder. From the day I moved in, she complained about trivial things: the length of my grass, the position of my trash bins, even the color of my holiday lights. She was the kind of person who thrived on conflict, and unfortunately for me, she seemed to have set her sights on finding fault with everything I did. At first I brushed off her remarks. It wasn't worth the energy to argue over something as small as where I placed my recycling bin. But over time, her attitude grew sharper, her comments louder, and her glares more hostile. I knew she didn't like dogs, but I assumed she would eventually accept Max's presence, especially since he never caused trouble. I was wrong. The first signs of real tension came on a quiet afternoon when Max was lying in the yard, sunbathing like he often did. Linda marched to the edge of her property, arms crossed tightly against her chest, and stared at him for several minutes before storming back inside. I thought nothing of it until the following week when I received a letter from the HOA, the letter that accused me of allowing a nuisance animal to disturb the neighborhood. It claimed that my dog barked excessively and intimidated passersby. I was stunned. Max was one of the quietest dogs anyone could own. The accusation didn't make sense. I walked around to speak with a few neighbors, and every single one of them confirmed the same thing. Max was harmless. Some even laughed at the suggestion he could be considered dangerous. It was clear who had filed the complaint. Linda. I wrote a response to the HOA defending Max and providing testimonies from neighbors. For a short while, things went quiet again. I assumed the matter had been resolved. But Linda was not finished. One evening, I was sitting on the porch watching Max trot around the yard with a tennis ball when flashing lights pulled into the street. A police car stopped in front of my house, and 2 officers stepped out. My heart sank. Max trotted over to me, wagging his tail, oblivious to the tension. The officers explained they had received a call about a dangerous and aggressive dog threatening neighbors. My stomach twisted as I realized what was happening. Linda had escalated her complaints from HOA letters to police reports. She was trying to get Max labeled as a dangerous animal, which could result in fines or even removal from my home. The officers quickly saw that Max was calm, friendly, and posed no threat. They patted him on the head and assured me everything looked fine. But the damage was done. A report had been filed, and that meant future complaints could build a case against me, no matter how false they were. That night, I sat awake long after the house had gone quiet. Linda had crossed a line. This was no longer about petty complaints. She wanted to weaponize the system against me and Max. What she didn't realize was that her obsession with trying to get us in trouble would soon expose her own secrets. Because while she had been busy plotting against my dog, she had overlooked one glaring truth. Her own backyard was filled with violations, some of them serious enough to attract more attention than she could ever handle. The first domino had fallen, and soon everything would spiral out of her control. The police visit lingered in my mind for days. Although the officers had left with smiles and kind words about Max, the fact that a formal report existed unsettled me. I knew how easily repeated complaints could build a false narrative, and Linda seemed determined to push her story of a dangerous dog, no matter how absurd it sounded. I began paying closer attention to her behavior. Every time I let Max outside, I noticed her blinds shifting. She was watching, documenting, waiting for something she could twist into another accusation. But what stood out even more was the growing clutter in her own backyard. From my upstairs window, I could see parts of it. A rusted trailer sat crooked against the fence, surrounded by piles of wood, tops, and bags of unknown material. At night, I sometimes heard odd noises, metal clanging, faint humming, or the sound of animals that didn't belong in a suburban yard. The irony was glaring. While she accused me of disturbing the peace with a dog that barely barked, her own property looked like a junkyard. Still, I kept quiet. I didn't want to stoop to her level, but fate has a way of working things out. 2 weeks after the police visit, a knock came at my door. It was a representative from Animal Control, clipboard in hand. My stomach dropped, assuming Linda had escalated her false claims again. The officer explained they had received another report about Max, describing him as aggressive and threatening children. I invited them in, showed them Max calmly lounging on the floor, and offered to let them observe him in the yard. Max wagged his tail, licked the officer's hand, and played fetch with the same energy he always had. Within minutes, the officer shook their head and admitted there was no sign of aggression. They asked if I knew who might be filing these complaints. I didn't have to say the name. Linda's reputation in the neighborhood already spoke for itself. But then something unexpected happened. As the officer prepared to leave, their eyes drifted toward Linda's backyard. From where they stood on my porch, they had a clear view of the trailer, the piles of debris, and what looked like makeshift cages pushed up against her fence. The officer frowned and made a quick note on their clipboard. That small glance set everything into motion. Later that evening, I watched as Linda stormed out into her backyard, pacing and muttering angrily. She seemed more frantic than usual, as if she sensed something was about to slip out of her control. The following day, 2 animal control vehicles arrived. They didn't stop at my house this time. They went straight to hers. From my porch, I watched the scene unfold. Officers inspected her backyard, pointing to the cages and lifting the tops that covered stacks of unknown materials. Linda argued, waved her arms, and even tried to block their path, but it was useless. They had authority and they were determined to see what she was hiding. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. Curious neighbors gathered at their windows and sidewalks, whispering as the officers continued their inspection. It was the first time Linda's carefully crafted image of being the neighborhood watchdog started to crumble. Instead of exposing me and Max, she was the one under scrutiny. By the end of that day, I learned that Linda's backyard contained unlicensed animals. She had been keeping exotic pets for bits, chickens, and even reptiles without the proper permits. On top of that, her property was riddled with safety violations, unstable structures, piles of waste, and conditions that could attract pests. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who called my calm, friendly dog a danger had been hiding a miniature zoo in her backyard. But this was only the beginning. What animal control discovered was just the surface of her problems. The deeper they looked, the more serious her violations became. And soon, the entire neighborhood would witness her downfall. The days following the animal control inspection felt surreal. For so long, Linda had projected an image of control policing lawns, critiquing mailboxes, and accusing others of violating the HOA's rules. She carried herself as if she were above everyone else, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards. But now, the spotlight had shifted, and for once it wasn't shining on me or my dog. It was locked squarely on her. Animal control's visit stirred up conversations across the block. Neighbors who usually kept their heads down were suddenly buzzing with stories. Some recalled late-night deliveries they had seen at Linda's house, large crates being wheeled into her backyard under tarps. Others mentioned strange odors drifting over the fence during summer evenings. One neighbor even admitted hearing animal cries that never seemed to belong to pets like dogs or cats. It became clear that Linda's secret had been hiding in plain sight for years, disguised by her constant attacks on others. By making herself the loudest complainer, she had distracted attention from her own violations. But now, with officials involved, that cover had evaporated. Within a week, animal control returned, this time with reinforcements. Trucks and additional officers arrived, and they spent hours documenting her backyard. They took photos, examined cages, and asked questions that Linda could not answer. Her attempts at charm and intimidation failed equally. I watched from my upstairs window as her arms flailed in frustration, her face reddened with anger, and her voice grew louder by the minute. The longer the inspection went on, the more neighbors gathered outside. People who once avoided Linda were now openly watching. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other, and a few even recorded clips from their phones. For years, she had embarrassed others with her constant accusations. Now, she was the one on display. Max, sitting quietly by my side as I looked out the window, seemed to sense the shift in energy. He tilted his head, watching the commotion with calm curiosity, as if he knew the truth was finally working its way to the surface. The following day, official notices were taped to Linda's front door. The papers flapped in the wind for all to see, bright against the neutral paint of her house. They cited violations ranging from unlicensed animals to hazardous property conditions. For the first time, it wasn't me or anyone else targeted by her constant need to control. It was her. The HOA board, which had always seemed hesitant to push back against Linda's complaints, now had no choice but to act. During the next meeting, word spread that her property was under formal investigation and that fines were already piling up. The very organization she once weaponized against me was now holding her accountable. Still, Linda didn't back down. Instead of admitting fault, she doubled down. She stormed into HOA meetings, shouting about conspiracies and accusing neighbors of spying on her. She even tried to shift the focus back onto Max, bringing up the same tired claims about him being a threat. But by now nobody believed her. Too many people had seen her backyard with their own eyes, or heard enough from officials to know where the real danger lay. In a strange way, the balance of the neighborhood began to shift. Neighbors who once avoided conflict found courage in each other. They started to share stories of Linda's past, harassment, false complaints, intimidation, and her constant attempts to control their lives. What had once been a quiet frustration bubbling under the surface was now boiling over into open resentment. And through it all I stayed quiet. I didn't need to gloat or fuel the fire. The truth was unfolding on its own, and the weight of Linda's actions was crashing down around her. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't over. People like Linda rarely surrendered. When their authority crumbled, they clawed for any scrap of power left. That clawing came sooner than expected. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the neighborhood was beginning to settle into its usual calm, I noticed movement in Linda's yard. She was dragging something heavy under the cover of darkness, large bags, crates, and what looked like disassembled cages. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being caught. It was clear she was trying to hide or remove evidence before the next inspection. But what she didn't realize was that several neighbors had already taken notice. From porches, windows, and sidewalks, people watched her frantic movements. Whispers spread. Photos were snapped. By the time she dragged the last crate toward her garage, half the block had witnessed her late-night scramble. The next morning, animal control arrived again, this time tipped off by neighbors who had reported her suspicious behavior. Linda opened her door reluctantly, her defiance slipping into nervousness. She tried to argue that the complaints were part of a neighborhood vendetta, but the officers were no longer listening. They had evidence, witnesses, and a growing file of violations that could not be explained away. As I watched them step back into her yard, I knew this was only going to escalate. The deeper they dug, the more they would uncover. And the more they uncovered, the harder it would be for Linda to hold on to the illusion of power she had spent years building. The cracks in her story were widening into fractures. Soon, they would shatter completely. By the time animal control returned with new inspections, Linda's grip on the neighborhood had already weakened. Once feared for her constant complaints and quick calls to the HOA, she was now a subject of gossip and quiet laughter. The same neighbors who had once avoided confrontation were sharing stories openly, passing judgment with a sense of relief that someone was finally holding her accountable. The new inspection was different from the earlier visits. This time, animal control arrived with city officials. A code enforcement officer joined them, clipboard in hand. Wearing a badge that carried more weight than Linda was prepared to handle. They didn't just walk her yard. They measured, photographed, and checked every structure. It was methodical, professional, and relentless. From my upstairs window, I could see the tension on Linda's face as the officers pointed to one of the makeshift sheds leaning dangerously against a fence. Its roof sagged under the weight of old tarps and the boards were rotting with mold. They took note of the foul smell drifting from piles of trash bags stacked along the fence line. Even from my yard, I'd caught whiffs of it before, an acrid mix of animal waste and decay. Now, it was official. Her property wasn't just an eyesore, it was a health hazard. Neighbors gathered again, some lingering at the ends of driveways, others watching from porches. The spectacle was impossible to ignore. Every note the officials made felt like a small victory for everyone who had endured Linda's wrath. For years she had nitpicked lawns, gardens, and mailboxes, filing complaints over trivial issues. Now the list of her own violations stretched longer than anyone could have imagined. Word spread quickly after that inspection. Not only had Linda been cited for keeping unlicensed animals, but she was also facing fines for unsafe structures, improper waste disposal, and even zoning violations. The backyard she had worked so hard to hide had become the centerpiece of her downfall. For me, there was a strange mix of satisfaction and caution. I wanted to feel relief, to enjoy the sight of justice finally catching up with her. But part of me knew Linda wouldn't go down quietly. She thrived on control, and losing it was something she couldn't accept. Sure enough, within days, she tried to turn the tables again. Flyers appeared in mailboxes around the neighborhood. They were cheaply printed, full of accusations about corruption in the HOA, conspiracies against her, and, once again, warnings about my dog. She insisted Max was a danger, trying to reignite the same baseless story that had started this entire mess. But this time, nobody listened. Neighbors tossed the flyers away, some laughing, others shaking their heads. It was clear the tide had turned. People were tired of her drama. They had witnessed enough to know where the real problems lay, and it wasn't with Max. Animal control wasn't finished either. They returned with a warrant to remove several of the animals she had been keeping illegally. Cages were carried out of her yard, loaded into trucks, and taken away. Rabbits, chickens, and reptiles were all confiscated. The scene was chaotic, Linda shouting at officers, neighbors whispering from the sidelines, and the sound of cages clanging as they were lifted. What struck me most was how powerless she looked. The woman who had once wielded complaints like weapons now stood on her lawn, red-faced and trembling, as her secrets were exposed to the world. It wasn't just her animals being taken away. It was her authority, her reputation, and the fear she had instilled in others. The HOA board, emboldened by the official findings, finally moved to act against her. Notices were sent threatening daily fines for each violation until her property was cleaned up. The same system she had used to harass others was now pressing down on her with full force. As the weeks passed, her yard grew quieter. The animals were gone, the tops removed, the piles of debris slowly hauled away under orders from the city. But the damage to her image was permanent. Neighbors no longer saw her as a watchdog. They saw her as a hypocrite. Through it all, Max remained the same. He lounged in the sun, greeted children with wagging tails, and watched calmly as the chaos unfolded next door. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. The dog she had painted as dangerous was the picture of peace, while she unraveled in public view. Still, I knew the story wasn't over. Linda had been cornered, humiliated, and fined, but she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She was plotting something. You could see it in her restless movements, the way she muttered to herself while pacing her driveway, the sharp look she cast toward my house whenever she thought no one was watching. She had lost her animals, her reputation, and her leverage with the HOA. All that was left was her bitterness. And bitterness, when fed long enough, turns into desperation. The neighborhood had turned against her. The law was involved, and her power was slipping through her fingers. But she wasn't finished yet. She was going to try one last move. By now, Linda's world had shrunk into a shadow of what it once was. The animals were gone. Her backyard stood exposed, and neighbors she had once dominated avoided her entirely. Yet, for someone like Linda, surrender wasn't an option. Instead of fading quietly into the background, she began to lash out in ways that revealed just how desperate she had become. The first sign of this came late one night. I was upstairs reading when Max perked up at the window. His ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, not of fear, but alertness. I looked outside and saw movement along the fence line. Linda was there, shining a flashlight into my yard. She scribbled in a notebook, snapping photos with her phone, as if she were gathering evidence for another complaint. But what could she possibly write this time? Max lay quietly by the back door, doing nothing but watching her. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it wasn't so unsettling. She was trying to rebuild her case, clinging to the one story she had pushed from the beginning, that Max was a menace. The next morning she proved it. A fresh complaint landed at the HOA office, claiming my dog had threatened her during her nightly walk. Never mind that the so-called walk had involved trespassing along the edge of my fence with a flashlight. She painted it as though Max had lunged at her, baring his teeth and snarling. Anyone who knew Max would recognize the lie. But Linda wasn't writing for logic. She was writing for survival. The board didn't buy it. Neither did Animal Control when she tried to report him again. They had already seen Max.com and Friendly, and they were well aware of a history of false claims. Each attempt she made only chipped away further at her credibility. But the more she was dismissed, the louder she became. Her outbursts grew public. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived armed with binders stuffed with papers, printed emails, photographs, handwritten notes. She slammed them onto the table, demanding action against me and my dog. She ranted about conspiracies, about neighbors plotting against her, about being the only one who cared about safety. Her voice rose to a near scream, drowning out anyone who tried to speak. But instead of rallying support, her performance backfired. The board members, once cautious around her, cut her short. They reminded her that her own property was under investigation and that her fines remained unpaid. Some neighbors laughed quietly in the back of the room, no longer afraid to mock the woman who had caused them so much grief. That meeting was a turning point. For the first time, Linda was officially silenced. The board adjourned without granting her requests, leaving her fuming as she stormed out of the community center, binders clutched tightly to her chest. Still, she wasn't done. A week later, flyers appeared again, this time taped to lampposts and community mailboxes. They accused the HOA of corruption, accused me of harboring a violent animal, and accused the entire neighborhood of conspiring against her. Language was frantic, almost unhinged. Instead of convincing anyone, the flyers became a joke kids pointed at them on their way to school. Neighbors chuckled as they tore them down, and one even taped a sarcastic note beneath, "Beware the terrifying golden retriever who sleeps 20 hours a day." Each failed attempt to regain control only deepened Linda's spiral. She stopped caring for her appearance, stumbling outside in wrinkled clothes, hair unkempt, her face etched with exhaustion. She spent hours pacing her driveway, glaring at houses, muttering under her breath. The woman who once thrived on controlling others now looked like someone being consumed by her own bitterness. But desperation has a way of pushing people further than expected, and Linda was about to cross a final line. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I had taken Max for a walk around the block, enjoying the sunshine, when we returned to find police cars once again parked in front of my house. My heart dropped. Linda succeeded in one of her complaints. But when I approached, I realized the situation was different. Asterisk this time, the officers weren't there for me. They were there for her. Asterisk a neighbor had caught Linda on camera trespassing into my yard earlier that morning. She had leaned over the fence, throwing something into the grass, then snapping photos of Max sniffing at it. The video clearly showed her trying to stage an incident. Whatever she had tossed into my yard was quickly collected as evidence by the responding officers. Asterisk when confronted, Linda erupted. She shouted at the officers, at the neighbors who had gathered to watch, at me, standing silently on my porch. She claimed it was all a setup, that she was the victim, that the entire neighborhood was out to destroy her, but the evidence was undeniable. The footage showed her actions, and her credibility had long since crumbled. Asterisk the officers didn't arrest her that day, but they left with a report thick enough to end any shred of doubt about her behavior. By evening, the story had spread to every household in the neighborhood. Linda had tried to frame my dog, and she had been caught. Asterisk that night. As I sat on the porch with Max at my side, I realized her desperation had finally crossed into self-destruction. She wasn't just losing battles anymore, she was actively handing victory to everyone who had endured her cruelty. Asterisk, and though she didn't know it yet, the fallout from that single act would be the final nail in her coffin. The gavel struck firmly, echoing through the silent courtroom. Linda's fate was sealed. The judge's words left no room for doubt. She was guilty on all counts. Guilty of harassment, guilty of filing false reports, guilty of violating HOA bylaws she had pretended to enforce. The penalties were heavy, thousands in fines, mandatory removal of every illegal structure in her backyard, and a permanent note on her record with the HOA that barred her from holding any position of authority in the future. Asterisk Linda's shoulders were slumped as reality sank in. For years she had ruled the neighborhood through fear and manipulation, but now, in front of the very community she once intimidated, she stood exposed. The mask of control had crumbled, leaving nothing but the truth for everyone to see. Asterisk when the verdict spread through the neighborhood, the response was almost immediate. Some residents expressed quiet relief, whispering to each other in the streets. Others didn't bother hiding their joy. About time, one neighbor muttered as he walked past Linda's house, shaking his head. Children, once too scared to play outside under Linda's watchful glare, now raced freely along the sidewalks. Parents decorated their homes again without worrying about anonymous complaints. Asterisk the air felt lighter. The neighborhood was finally free. Asterisk but Linda's world grew darker by the day. The cheerful patrols she used to take around the block disappeared. No more warning notes appeared on doorsteps. No more knocks on doors demanding compliance. Her blinds stayed drawn, her yard overgrown, her fences neglected. The woman who had demanded perfection from everyone else couldn't keep her own house in order. Asterisk she had tried to paint Max, a gentle, quiet dog, as dangerous, yet it was her own lies, her own greed, and her own illegal backyard setup that made her the villain in everyone's eyes. Asterisk and Max. He became the symbol of peace the neighborhood hadn't realized it needed. Neighbors greeted him warmly now, bending down to scratch his ears or offering him treats on evening walks. Children giggled as he wagged his tail, rolling over for belly rubs. People who had once given me sympathetic looks for being Linda's target now smiled, joking about the terror of Maple Street whenever Max lay lazily in the grass, his tongue hanging out, too relaxed to even bark. Asterisk the irony was undeniable. Linda had tried to destroy us with lies, but Max's calm innocence revealed the truth more powerfully than anything I could have said. He didn't need to defend himself. He simply kept being the good dog he always was. And in that quiet goodness, the lies crumbled. Asterisk weeks turned into months. The HOA, once feared because of Linda's influence, began operating with fairness again. Meetings were calm, decisions made without threats or shouting. The neighbors grew closer, united by the storm they had endured together. And though Linda still lived among us, she was no longer a force to fear. She had become invisible, her power gone, her voice silenced by her own actions. Asterisk one warm evening. I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low across the rooftops. Max stretched beside me, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden steps. Across the street, kids rode bikes, their laughter ringing through the air. A couple waved as they passed, calling out a cheerful greeting. Asterisk for the first time since moving. Here I felt true peace. Not the fragile, temporary quiet Linda once demanded, but real peace, the kind that grows when people look out for each other instead of tearing each other down. Asterisk I glanced at Max. He looked up at me, eyes calm, tail wagging, as if he knew. The dog Linda had called dangerous had given us back our home, our neighborhood, and our freedom. Asterisk the battle was over, and we had won not through anger or revenge, but through truth, patience, and the loyalty of a dog who never stopped being good. Asterisk Linda had tried to take everything from us. In the end, she lost everything herself. Asterisk, and as the last light of the day faded, I realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes, the quietest voices speak the loudest truths, and sometimes, the smallest victories, like a wagging tail on a summer evening, are the ones that mean the most. Asterisk, the neighborhood was finally ours again. And that's the end of today's story. Asterisk, if you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below about what you think Linda deserved. Asterisk, your support helps us share more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.